This is a true life story. This man was sentenced to death in Texas for killing his 3 children in a fire, even after scientific evidence and expert testimony bolstered his claims of innocence. The jury, his wife, the police, and even prisoners did not believe him. In this video, I will explain how Todd Willingham suffered 12 years on death row after a home fire accident killed his 3 daughters in the movie. Trial by Fire. The movie begins 2 days before Christmas in Corsicana, Texas. Tragedy struck the life of 23-year-old Willingham. As he frantically fled his engulfed house, coughing and barefoot, he desperately screamed for help to rescue his 3 precious girls, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins Cameron and Carmen, who were still trapped inside. A young girl playing outside immediately rushed to her mother, who happened to be Willingham's neighbor, seeking aid. Witnessing the flames, she promptly dialed 911. In his desperate attempt to save his daughters, Willingham, shirtless and in anguish, tried to break the window but inadvertently caused an explosion, leading him to weep as firefighters approached. The burnt children, along with their charred toys, were carefully extracted and taken to a lab for evidence. The investigators thoroughly examined the house to determine the cause of the fire. Willingham and his wife, Stacy, were summoned for questioning. Stacy, absent during the tragedy, explained she had been at the Salvation Army buying Christmas presents for the kids due to their financial struggles, raising suspicions. Flashing back to the day before the incident, tensions brewed between the couple as Willingham returned home after a night out. His attempts at affection were rebuffed by Stacy, who accused him of staying out all night. The investigator probed further, learning about a confrontation where Stacy found a condom in Willingham's pocket, berating him as a loser with no job. She cautioned him against violence, revealing a history of abuse, highlighting his drinking habits that hindered her ability to earn for the family. On the ill-fated morning, after Stacy left for work, Willingham discovered the tragic reality of his burning home and tried unsuccessfully to rescue his children. The heart-wrenching burial of the young victims followed the next day, leaving a shattered family in the wake of the Christmas tragedy. Following the heartbreaking burial, on their way home, Willingham attempts to talk to his wife, but she remains unwilling to listen, urging him to stop the car. Refusing her plea, he is accused of failing to save their children. Soon after, they are halted by the police, leading to Willingham's arrest on murder charges. Despite his protests of innocence, he is confined to a cell, enduring accusations from a police officer insinuating he killed his own kids. In jail, Willingham attempts to assert dominance over his cellmate. The next day, his wife arrives with a lawyer advising him to plead guilty, but Willingham, confident in his innocence, rejects the suggestion, believing he can convince the judge of his truth. The townspeople gossip about the possibility of him setting the fire, and even his neighbor testifies against him, claiming he didn't try to rescue the kids and had a suspicious demeanor. During the trial, investigators persuade the courtroom that Willingham created a pentagram with lighter fluid, and his cellmate falsely testifies that Willingham confessed to the crime. Despite Willingham's attempts to refute the accusations, the court also hears allegations of his past violence towards Stacy, leading to a miscarriage, a claim she denies, though Willingham had indeed abused her. Stacy insists in court that her husband, despite his flaws, didn't harm their children, expressing certainty in his love for them, yet her plea falls on deaf ears. The court-appointed attorney, showing disdain, attempts to persuade Willingham to plead guilty, dismissing him as poor, unintelligent, aggressive, and unsettling. Despite Willingham's constant denial of murder, the jury swiftly convicts him within an hour, leading to a death sentence. In prison, he endures physical assaults and verbal abuse from fellow inmates, labeled a baby killer. Tired of the taunts, he engages in a fight but is overpowered, prompting a guard to intervene and halt the violence. Subsequently, Willingham is escorted by police officers to an isolated room where he endures further beatings. In the aftermath, flooded with memories of his life with Stacy and their children, he vents his anger by striking the foam in his cell. Haunted by the recollection of his child's voice before the tragic fire, he envisions the flames and inflicts self-harm on the door until blood stains his head. 12 weeks later, still confined to death row, Willingham, desperate to connect with Stacy, requests pen and paper. He writes heartfelt letters, pleading his innocence and questioning her absence during visits. Stacy, residing with her grandmother, remains steadfast in believing her husband's innocence, but her grandmother dismisses the notion. Undeterred, Willingham reminisces about their shared moments, continuing to send unanswered letters. Witnessing fellow inmates taken away for execution, he engages in conversations with them, learning about their crimes. One inmate cynically explains the term capital punishment, emphasizing that without capital, one faces punishment, a grim reality unfolding before Willingham's eyes. Later, a fellow inmate advises Willingham on obtaining a lawyer without funds and suggests writing to Texas Justice. Acquiring a new lawyer, Willingham is provided with legal books, though he loses faith in their depiction of an elusive justice system. Growing closer to his cellmate amid the grim spectacle of fellow inmates facing execution, he gradually adapts to prison life. When his cellmate faces imminent death, he shares the somber details, including his last meal, before being taken to the gas chamber. 7 years later, the narrative introduces Elizabeth Gilbert into the unfolding story. Receiving a letter from Willingham, Elizabeth Gilbert becomes intrigued by his story and decides to delve into his case, despite her children's belief that he deserves the death penalty. Her daughter, considering him a murderer, finds the situation gross. Despite the negative opinions, Willingham persistently sends letters expressing his thoughts and the isolation of death row. When Elizabeth finally visits him, he appreciates her for being his first visitor in a long time. During their conversation, Willingham discloses his estrangement from his wife and his family residing in Oklahoma. Elizabeth, keen to understand his life in jail, reciprocates by sharing details about the outside world. Willingham, having spent 8 years in prison, vehemently asserts his innocence, swearing his love for his children. The conversation goes well, with Elizabeth noting his gentleness and later recounting the encounter to her friends. One of Elizabeth's friends claims that Willingham was a devil worshipper, accusing him of sacrificing his kids to Satan in a horrific act. This friend warns Elizabeth against falling in love with him. When Elizabeth returns home, she learns about her ex-husband's death from her kids. Despite the rumors, Willingham continues writing letters to Elizabeth, expressing gratitude for her visits and diligently studying the law books provided. He asserts that he has found his way in the world and is no longer the lost 24-year-old he once was. Observing Elizabeth's changed demeanor, her daughter encourages her to visit Willingham again. During their next meeting, they discuss Elizabeth's kids, her ex-husband's death, and Willingham shares a poignant poem he wrote about his own children. Willingham continues his education, building relationships with some of the police officers, and envisions his first daughter in his cell, apologizing for not reaching their aid in time. Elizabeth engages in a correspondence with Willingham, sharing aspects of her life as a mother, while he envisions himself participating in her daily activities. Their exchange deepens as Willingham sends letters and drawings, and Elizabeth becomes more invested in his life. Determined to seek justice, she revisits his case, obtaining court transcripts and thoroughly studying the details. Elizabeth goes a step further, meeting David Houghton, one of the witnesses against Willingham, expressing her desire to ensure a fair trial. With the intention of reopening the case, she diligently interviews those who testified, including Willingham's former cell partner, striving to confirm the truth and uncover any potential falsehoods in the testimonies against him. As Elizabeth immerses herself in Willingham's case, she discovers that the district attorney had promised a reduced sentence to a witness in exchange for testifying against him. Returning to Willingham with this revelation, she urges him not to lose hope. Meanwhile, at home, Elizabeth learns that the doctor who labeled Willingham a sociopath hadn't even met him and was routinely brought in whenever a guaranteed death penalty was needed. Her intense focus on the case strains her relationship with her kids, prompting her daughter to confront her. Undeterred, Elizabeth passionately continues her efforts to prove Willingham's innocence, even taking her cause to the radio. As the execution date approaches, she visits Willingham once more to update him on her progress. However, he discloses that he lied to her and everyone else, just days before he is set to face the imminent tragedy of his own execution. Willingham confesses to Elizabeth that he attempted to reach his girls, but the intense heat prevented him from saving them, acknowledging his guilt for being unable to rescue his own children from the fiery tragedy. Distraught, Elizabeth informs Willingham's lawyer that he wishes to halt the efforts to prove his innocence. Undeterred, she visits Stacy, imploring her assistance. With only 11 days until Willingham's scheduled execution, Elizabeth consults a doctor who discusses astrology and demonstrates the misconceptions in the investigator's arson claims. Using gas and water examples, he reveals that the fire was accidental, caused by a space heater, challenging the initial arson hypothesis. Armed with this information, Elizabeth returns to Willingham, informing him of the significant progress made in proving the fire was not intentional arson, offering a glimmer of hope in the 11th hour. Willingham expresses his loss of hope to Elizabeth, acknowledging its detrimental impact while thanking her for her unyielding support. Despite efforts to reprocess his file, his case is denied once again. Stacy finally visits him in prison, but their encounter turns into an argument when Willingham urges her to make a statement to help him, a plea she vehemently refuses. As the execution looms 5 days away, he is moved to a cell closer to the chamber. The televised coverage prompts his former cellmate, Johnny Webb, to admit on air that he was coerced into testifying against Willingham and declares his guilt. However, the district attorney ignores Webb's letter. Willingham, haunted by visions of his deceased daughter, grapples with the impending tragedy just 2 days before his scheduled execution, while Elizabeth remains steadfast in her visits, navigating a challenging pursuit of justice. As the day of Willingham's scheduled execution approaches, he confides in Elizabeth, expressing fear not of death itself but of facing it alone. He implores her to promise that she'll be there to witness his final moments. Elizabeth, increasingly despondent, blames herself for not discovering the truth sooner, while her daughter attempts to console her. On the eve of his death, Willingham has his last meal in prison. En route to see him, Elizabeth calls his lawyer, pleading for intervention with the governor. But she meets with an accident, breaking her neck and potentially losing the ability to walk. Despite her injuries, Willingham is taken to the gas chamber, where Stacy and others witness his execution. In his final words, he proclaims his innocence, requests cremation, and asks for his ashes to be spread over his daughter's grave. As the lethal medications are administered, Willingham succumbs to death, feeling his daughter's touch one last time, leaving a heart-wrenching end to his tragic tale. Elizabeth recovers and receives Willingham's posthumous letter describing a dream about his daughter. At her daughter's grave, his son pours Willingham's ashes. Undeterred, Elizabeth persistently fights for Willingham's innocence. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe.